The sun hung mercilessly over the Nevada desert as Li Wei studied the dynamite crates stacked beside the railroad camp. After 3 years of blasting through mountain passes for the Central Pacific, he knew explosives better than anyone, knowledge that had earned him the American name Henry from the foreman who couldn't pronounce his given name. The other Chinese workers respected him as their unofficial leader, though the white bosses saw them all as interchangeable tools for their westward expansion. Frank Clark, the lead foreman, strutted through the camp with his ever-present scowl, kicking over a worker's rice bowl as he passed. Henry watched silently, hands clenched, as the man cowered and scrambled to clean the spilled food. 3 years of such treatment had taught Henry to hide his anger behind careful observation. He noted how Frank's gun hung loose in its holster, how the man's stride favored his left leg from an old injury. The camp buzzed with nervous energy as word spread of disappearances from other railroad crews along the line. 3 Chinese workers had vanished from a camp 20 miles east, then 2 more from another site. The white foreman dismissed it as desertion, but Henry knew better. His men were sending their pay home to families in China. They wouldn't abandon that responsibility. Something darker was happening in these harsh lands between El Paso and Cheyenne. Daniel Moore, the only foreman who treated the Chinese workers with any humanity, approached Henry as the sun began to set. "Got word from up the line," he said quietly. "Another worker missing from Anderson's crew. They found blood this time." Henry nodded grimly. Daniel was the rare white man who saw past skin color to recognize competence. He'd been the one to first notice Henry's skill with explosives, promoting him to demolition crew chief despite Frank Clark's protests. The desert wind carried the smell of sage and creosote as Henry walked among the workers' tents that evening. Worried whispers in Cantonese filled the air. Many feared bandits, but Henry suspected something more organized. The disappearances followed the railroad's progress too precisely. He shared his concerns with Charlie, his closest friend since the sea voyage from Canton. Charlie had been teaching him English while Henry taught him about explosives and engineering. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. The moon cast sharp shadows through the canvas tent as he reviewed his mental map of the surrounding territory. The railroad cut through ancient trails used by native tribes and Mexican traders. Perfect hiding places dotted the hills: caves, box canyons, abandoned mines. If someone was taking his people, they knew this land well. He was still awake when the first screams shattered the pre-dawn silence. Henry burst from his tent to see mounted figures moving through the camp like shadows. Their faces were covered, but their movements were practiced, deliberate. These were no common bandits. 2 riders had already seized a struggling worker. Henry sprinted for the dynamite crates as more screams erupted. Behind him, Frank Clark emerged from the foreman's cabin, firing wildly into the air while shouting about thieving coolies. The attackers wheeled their horses with military precision, 2 men dragging their captive while others provided covering fire. Henry reached the explosives just as Charlie rushed to help him. Together they prized open a crate, but a bullet splintered the wood near their hands. Henry looked up to see one of the raiders bearing down on them. Charlie shoved him aside as the horse thundered past, taking the full impact himself. He crumpled without a sound. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Henry watched helplessly as the raiders disappeared into the darkness with their captive. Charlie lay motionless beside the dynamite crate. Daniel Moore was organizing men to give chase, while Frank Clark bellowed accusations about an inside job. But Henry barely heard them. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating distances to likely hideouts, remembering every detail about the raiders' appearance and tactics. They would return. Raiders this organized always did. Next time, he would be ready. The desert sunrise revealed the aftermath. 2 workers dead, including Charlie, 1 taken, and the camp in shambles. Henry stood silent as Daniel Moore argued with Frank Clark about sending for the sheriff in Cheyenne. Clark insisted it was a waste of time. Just Chinamen, while Moore demanded justice. Henry ignored them both, focusing instead on the raiders' tracks. Their horses had been shod recently, the prints too clean for long-range travel. Their hideout had to be close. Robert Taylor, the company paymaster, arrived mid-morning for his weekly visit. The thin man's face went pale at the news, though Henry noticed he seemed more concerned about the work stoppage than the deaths. When Taylor mentioned that similar raids had hit 3 other camps moving west along the line, Henry's suspicions crystallized. This was no random violence. Someone was systematically targeting the railroad's most vulnerable workers. As the morning heat intensified, Henry traced his fingers along the leather of his work belt, feeling the familiar pouches of blasting powder and detonator caps. Years of setting charges for the railroad had taught him to read terrain like a book, and these raiders had left clear signatures. Their horses' prints showed they favored the northern ridge paths, where limestone outcroppings provided natural cover. More telling were the scattered bits of distinctive red clay, a type he'd only seen in one nearby canyon. Daniel Moore approached, his boots kicking up dust clouds in the parched earth. "Henry, I've convinced Taylor to leave 2 armed guards here while we track these bastards." He lowered his voice, glancing toward where Frank Clark stood, berating a group of Chinese workers. "Clark wants to press on with construction, says we can't afford delays. But I saw how they took Charlie, professional work, military precision. These aren't common bandits." Henry nodded, remembering Charlie's attempts to teach him English during long evenings by the work fires. The old man had shown him kindness when others saw only a faceless laborer. Now his blood stained the desert sand, and Henry felt the weight of unspoken debts. He began gathering his tools: fuse wire, percussion caps, the specialized charges he'd developed for splitting particularly stubborn rock faces. These same skills could serve a different purpose. The afternoon brought Margaret Taylor, Robert's wife, riding in from Cheyenne with supplies and news. Her normally pristine dress was dust-covered, her face drawn with worry as she described similar attacks moving steadily westward. "The sheriff's spread too thin," she explained, handing Daniel a worn map. "3 more camps hit last week. They're taking skilled workers, blasters, engineers, anyone who knows the technical side of railroad work." Henry studied the map's markings while Margaret spoke with Laura, the camp cook, about missing provisions. A pattern emerged. The raiders struck isolated sections, always near geological features that would hamper pursuit. But their latest attack revealed overconfidence. They'd left clear signs of their direction, almost as if daring anyone to follow. Perhaps they believed no one would risk lives to rescue just Chinamen. As sunset approached, Henry finished his preparations. He'd packed enough explosives to move a mountain, though he planned to use them with surgical precision. Daniel had convinced 3 other workers to join them, all experienced hands who'd worked alongside Charlie and shared his respect for their Chinese colleagues. They would leave at first light, following the tracks north toward the Red Clay Canyon. That evening, Henry sat alone by the dying campfire, maintaining his tools with practiced care. The desert wind carried fragments of conversation. Clark arguing with Taylor about construction schedules, Margaret insisting on bringing in additional security, Laura organizing supplies for the search party. But Henry's thoughts remained focused on the terrain ahead, plotting approaches through the complex maze of canyons and ridges. He knew these lands intimately from months of survey work, understanding their secrets in ways the raiders couldn't. Every blast hole he'd drilled, every charge he'd set, had taught him the desert's hidden weaknesses. Tomorrow, those who dismissed Chinese workers as expendable would learn the true value of such knowledge. Henry allowed himself a rare smile as he checked his equipment one final time. The raiders had made a fatal mistake. They'd assumed their targets were prey, not hunters. The night deepened, stars emerging in the vast desert sky. Henry heard soft footsteps and turned to find Daniel approaching with a Winchester rifle. "You'll need this," the foreman said quietly, offering the weapon. "I've seen you at target practice. You shoot better than most." The gesture spoke volumes. Company policy strictly forbade Chinese workers from carrying firearms. But out here, far from civilization's rules, survival demanded trust. Henry accepted the rifle with a slight bow, his traditional gesture of respect carrying new meaning. Tomorrow would test not just their tracking skills and courage, but the bonds forged through months of shared labor. As he cleaned the weapon, Henry recalled Charlie's words about America being a land of transformation. Perhaps it was time to prove that even a humble railroad worker could become something unexpected, a defender of justice in this harsh frontier. The scorching desert sun beat down mercilessly as Ming-Wei crouched behind a cluster of weathered boulders, his heart pounding. Through narrowed eyes, he watched the dust cloud approaching the railroad work camp from the south. 6 riders, their intentions clear from the rifles glinting in their hands. Behind him, the hastily evacuated camp lay silent, tools abandoned mid-task as the workers had scattered into hiding among the rocky outcrops. Frank Taylor, the railroad foreman, had ignored Ming's warnings about suspicious tracks spotted that morning. "Get back to work, Chinaman," he'd sneered. But Ming had quietly spread the word among his fellow workers anyway. Now, as the riders drew closer, Ming's fingers traced the outline of the small detonator in his pocket, a tool meant for clearing the railway path that might serve a different purpose today. The disappearances had started 3 weeks ago. First, Charlie Anderson, a young surveyor who'd treated the Chinese workers with rare kindness, vanished while scouting ahead. Then Robert Moore, one of the supply wagon drivers. Most recently, 2 Chinese workers had failed to return from gathering water. The local sheriff in Cheyenne had shown little interest in investigating, assuming the missing men had simply deserted. Ming had worked the railroads long enough to know better. The timing of the disappearances matched perfectly with the arrival of Daniel Walker's gang in the territory. Walker was notorious for raiding work camps, not just for valuables but for workers themselves. Forced labor for his secret silver mining operation in the mountains. Ming had lost friends to Walker's schemes before, back on the Central Pacific Line. The camp's official security detail was woefully inadequate. Just Henry Clark and 2 other guards who spent more time harassing the Chinese workers than watching for actual threats. Ming had seen them flee at the first sign of the approaching riders, leaving the camp defenseless. But Ming knew these hills better than any of them, having spent countless hours studying the terrain while laying explosive charges for tunnel construction. Behind him, he heard the soft shuffle of feet as Laura Anderson, the camp cook and Charlie's sister, crept up beside him. Unlike most, she'd shown genuine concern when her brother vanished, even learning a few words of Cantonese to ask the Chinese workers for information. "There are more coming from the east," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "I counted at least 8 riders." Ming nodded grimly. Walker's gang was being unusually bold, attacking in broad daylight. They must be desperate for workers, which meant the missing men might still be alive. He pulled out a crude map he'd drawn of the surrounding area, showing Laura the network of narrow canyons and dried creek beds he'd discovered. "We can use these to move unseen," he explained in careful English. "But first, we make them think twice about coming closer." Working quickly, Ming retrieved several explosive charges from his carefully hidden cache nearby. The railroad company strictly controlled these materials, but he'd been secretly setting aside small amounts, sensing trouble was coming. Laura helped him position them strategically among the rocks, her hands steady despite her fear. They worked in silence, communicating through gestures and shared glances. The first explosion caught Walker's men completely by surprise. Ming had calculated the placement perfectly, close enough to spray them with rocks and dirt, far enough to avoid serious injury. The horses reared in panic, throwing 2 riders. The second blast, seconds later, sent them scrambling for cover. Through his binoculars, Ming recognized Daniel Walker himself, cursing as he tried to regain control of his spooked mount. But their victory was short-lived. A shout from the eastern ridge revealed a second group of bandits had circled behind the camp. Ming watched in horror as they dragged 3 railroad workers from their hiding places, including Susan Clark, the telegraph operator who'd been trying to signal for help. The bandits were using their own people as human shields now, making Ming's explosives useless. Laura grabbed Ming's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "That's Charlie," she gasped, pointing to a figure among Walker's men. Ming squinted and saw she was right. Charlie Anderson was there, but not as a captive. He rode freely alongside Walker, his face set in a cold expression Ming had never seen before. The pieces suddenly fell into place. Charlie hadn't been kidnapped. He'd been Walker's spy all along. The betrayal struck Ming like a physical blow. He'd trusted Charlie, shared meals with him, taught him Chinese phrases. More importantly, he'd told Charlie about the hidden canyon passages, the very routes Ming had planned to use for escape. Now those secrets were in Walker's hands, and the lives of everyone in the camp hung by a thread. Ming felt Laura trembling beside him, her brother's treachery hitting her even harder. They watched helplessly as Walker's men began methodically searching the camp, calling out for workers to surrender. Ming's mind raced, searching for options. The main explosives storage was too far to reach. The telegraph lines had been cut, and their escape routes were compromised. But then he remembered something. An old mining shaft he'd discovered while surveying, its entrance hidden by years of erosion. If they could reach it, Ming touched Laura's shoulder, drawing her attention away from the heart-wrenching sight of her brother among the outlaws. In whispered words, he outlined a desperate plan. It would mean splitting up, creating diversions, and taking enormous risks. But Laura's eyes hardened with determination as she listened. She'd lost her brother to Walker's influence. She wouldn't lose anyone else today. Ming led Laura through the deepening shadows between the workers' tents, their footsteps muffled by the soft desert sand. The setting sun painted the canyon walls in brilliant oranges and reds, but neither had time to appreciate the beauty. Ahead, Walker's men were systematically working their way through the camp, their harsh voices carrying on the evening breeze as they threatened and bullied the workers into submission. The old mining shaft lay a quarter-mile north, its entrance obscured by scrub brush and years of wind-blown sand. Ming had discovered it while placing demolition charges for the railroad cut, a relic from an earlier, failed attempt to tame these harsh lands. Now it might prove their salvation, if they could reach it without being spotted by Walker's lookouts posted on the ridgeline above. Laura stumbled slightly, her city boots ill-suited for the rough terrain. Ming caught her arm, steadying her. "We must move faster," he whispered. Before they finished searching the eastern section, his English had improved dramatically over the past year, though his accent remained thick. Laura nodded grimly, forcing herself to focus on their immediate survival rather than the bitter knowledge of her brother's betrayal. They paused behind a stack of railroad ties as two of Walker's men passed nearby, rifles held ready. Ming's heart pounded as he recognized one of them, Frank, a former foreman who'd been fired for his cruel treatment of the Chinese workers. The man's face was twisted with malicious satisfaction as he struck a cowering worker with his rifle butt, demanding information about the payroll strongbox. Using the distraction, Ming and Laura slipped away toward the northern rim of the camp. The terrain grew steadily more treacherous, loose scree giving way to larger boulders. Ming led them on a winding path, carefully choosing each step. Behind them, shouts and the occasional gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. Walker was growing impatient with the search. Near the shaft entrance, Ming pulled Laura behind a wind-carved boulder as voices approached. Two more of Walker's men. She recognized Charlie, another former worker with a grudge. They were discussing Walker's plans to use the captured Chinese laborers as hostages, forcing the railroad company to pay an enormous ransom. The casual cruelty in their voices made Laura's blood run cold. Ming's expression hardened as he listened. He'd seen too many of his countrymen treated as disposable tools by the railroad, and now these bandits viewed them the same way. His knowledge of explosives and the terrain might be their only advantage. The mining shaft connected to a maze of tunnels he'd carefully mapped while exploring. If they could reach the main explosives cache through the underground network. Laura seemed to read his thoughts. "It's too dangerous," she whispered. "The tunnels could collapse." Ming met her concerned gaze with quiet determination. "More dangerous than staying here?" he responded softly. "Walker will not show mercy, even to you." They both knew he was right. Walker's reputation for brutality was well-earned, and Laura's brother's presence wouldn't protect her. The sun had nearly set now, throwing long shadows across the rocky ground. They waited until Charlie and his companion moved away. Then Ming led Laura to the concealed shaft entrance. Years of erosion had partially filled it with sand, but the original timber supports still held. Ming carefully brushed away enough sand to reveal the narrow opening. "Ladies first," he said with a slight smile, helping Laura through the gap. The shaft plunged steeply downward, old wooden steps creaking ominously under their weight. The air grew cooler and damper as they descended, carrying the musty scent of age and abandonment. Ming produced a small tin of matches from his pocket, lighting their way. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, making the descent even more treacherous. Laura tried not to think about the tons of rock above them, focusing instead on following Ming's sure-footed progress. He seemed to know exactly where they were going, counting support beams and noting subtle marks on the walls. The main tunnel branched repeatedly, but Ming never hesitated in choosing their path. Above, Walker's men would soon discover their absence. Time was running out. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Charlie Wong crouched behind a pile of dynamite crates, his heart pounding against his ribs. 3 days had passed since the bandits raided the railroad camp, taking Daniel Clark and 4 other workers hostage. The foreman, Henry Anderson, had written them off as lost, declaring it too dangerous to mount a rescue. But Charlie knew the twisted canyons of these mountains better than anyone, having spent months carefully planning demolition work for the railroad cuts. Through the pre-dawn haze, Charlie studied the bandit camp nestled in a narrow box canyon 2 miles north of the rail line. He'd tracked them here by following displaced rocks and scraps of cloth torn from Daniel's distinctive blue shirt. The outlaws had chosen their hideout well. A single narrow entrance guarded by armed men. Steep cliff walls rising hundreds of feet on 3 sides. But Charlie saw what they didn't. A network of unstable rock formations that could bring the entire canyon wall down with precisely placed charges. Susan Taylor, the camp cook's wife, who had befriended Charlie despite others' prejudices, had helped him borrow enough dynamite for his rescue plan. She understood his determination to save Daniel, the only foreman who had treated the Chinese workers with basic human dignity. When Daniel had fallen ill with fever 2 months prior, Charlie had nursed him back to health using traditional medicines, forming an unlikely friendship that transcended the racial barriers of the frontier. The bandits' leader, Frank Moore, had a reputation for brutality that made Charlie's blood run cold. 3 weeks earlier, Moore's gang had raided a stagecoach bound for El Paso, leaving no survivors. Now they were demanding an impossible ransom, $5,000 in gold coin, knowing the railroad company would never pay to rescue mere laborers, especially Chinese ones. But Charlie had seen too many of his countrymen die building this railroad to abandon Daniel and the others to such a fate. As the sun climbed higher, Charlie carefully distributed his explosives among the rocky outcrops, using all his years of experience to identify the key pressure points. One wrong placement could bring down the wrong section of wall or alert the bandits too soon. He thought of his father's teachings about patience and precision, passed down through generations of stone carvers in their village. Those same skills that had helped him survive the brutal work of railroad building would now help him save his friend. Robert Walker, another sympathetic foreman, had provided Charlie with a Winchester rifle, technically forbidden for Chinese workers to possess. Charlie had spent nights practicing with it in secret, knowing that explosives alone wouldn't be enough. He positioned the rifle carefully behind a boulder overlooking the canyon entrance, then continued his preparations. The rescue would require perfect timing. The initial blast would block the canyon mouth, trapping the bandits inside, while secondary explosions would create a pathway for the hostages to escape. Through his borrowed spyglass, Charlie observed the camp's routine. The hostages were kept in a makeshift pen near the back of the canyon, guarded by 2 men who rotated shifts every 4 hours. Moore and 3 others occupied the main tent, while 2 sentries patrolled the entrance. Charlie had counted 11 bandits total. Terrible odds for one man, but the element of surprise and careful planning would have to make up for his lack of numbers. As afternoon approached, Charlie noticed increased activity in the camp. Through fragments of overheard conversation, he learned that Moore was growing impatient with the railroad's lack of response. The bandit leader had sent a message threatening to kill 1 hostage each day until the ransom was paid. Time was running out. Charlie knew he would have to act before sunset, when the bandits typically executed their threats to maintain their fearsome reputation. A dust cloud on the horizon caught Charlie's attention, riders approaching from the direction of Cheyenne. Through the spyglass, he recognized Henry Anderson leading a group of armed men. Charlie's heart sank, knowing the prejudiced foreman would likely botch any rescue attempt and get the hostages killed. Anderson had never valued Chinese lives, viewing them as replaceable tools. Charlie realized he would have to trigger his plan immediately, before Anderson's ill-conceived assault could doom them all. With trembling hands steadied by determination, Charlie lit the first fuse. The explosion shattered the afternoon quiet, sending a cascade of boulders that sealed the canyon entrance. Gunfire erupted as the bandits realized they were under attack. Charlie's rifle cracked, dropping the 2 sentries before they could raise the alarm. The second series of charges detonated precisely as planned, creating a sheltered path along the eastern wall that only Charlie knew to look for. Through the chaos and gun smoke, Charlie worked his way down into the canyon. The bandits were firing blindly at the blocked entrance, expecting an attack from that direction. None thought to look up at the Chinese worker moving like a shadow along the cliff face. Charlie reached the hostage pen undetected, using his wire cutters to create an opening. Daniel's eyes widened with recognition, but Charlie quickly gestured for silence as he led the 5 men toward the escape route. Frank Moore finally spotted them as they neared the hidden path. The bandit leader's shot caught Charlie in the shoulder, spinning him against the canyon wall. But decades of dangerous railroad work had taught Charlie to function through pain. His return fire struck Moore in the chest, giving the hostages time to scramble up the protected route. Charlie followed, fighting waves of dizziness as his blood soaked the rocks beneath him. They emerged from the canyon just as Henry Anderson's posse arrived. The foreman's expression shifted from shock to grudging respect as he saw Charlie leading the rescued hostages to safety. Daniel Clark immediately began treating Charlie's wound, refusing to let anyone else touch his friend. In the canyon below, the trapped bandits found themselves caught between the posse's guns and the walls Charlie's explosives had made unscalable. The story of how a Chinese railroad worker outsmarted Frank Moore's gang spread quickly along the frontier. The railroad company, pressured by public sentiment and Daniel Clark's influence, was forced to acknowledge Charlie's heroism. They promoted him to demolition foreman, the first Chinese worker to hold such a position. More importantly to Charlie, his actions helped change attitudes in the camp, as men who had once shunned him now sought his friendship and expertise. As winter approached, Charlie's new position brought unexpected challenges. The other Chinese workers looked to him as a bridge between their community and the railroad management, while some of the white foremen quietly resented taking orders from him. Daniel Clark remained his steadfast ally, helping Charlie navigate the complex social and political dynamics of the camp. Together, they developed more efficient and safer blasting techniques that caught the attention of railroad executives in Cheyenne. The harsh desert winds howled through the camp as Charlie received word that Frank Moore had escaped custody during transfer to El Paso. The news sent ripples of unease through the work crews, particularly among the Chinese laborers who feared retribution. Charlie spent sleepless nights organizing watch rotations and teaching his men defensive positions in the rocky terrain they knew so intimately. During this tense period, Robert Thompson, a railroad executive from Cheyenne, arrived to evaluate the progress. Unlike many officials, he took a genuine interest in Charlie's innovations and the improved efficiency of the Chinese work crews. Through careful observation, Charlie noticed Robert spending long hours studying maps of the territory, particularly focusing on a remote stretch between their current position and Deadwood. One evening, as Charlie and Daniel shared a meal in the medical tent, Robert confided his suspicions that someone within the railroad company had been feeding information to outlaw gangs, explaining how Frank Moore's gang had known exactly when and where to strike. The pattern of raids suggested inside knowledge of payroll shipments and worker movements. The breakthrough came when Charlie discovered discrepancies in the supply manifests. Certain shipments of blasting powder had been consistently over-ordered but under-delivered. Following the paper trail led to a shocking revelation. Henry Anderson, the foreman who had seemingly redeemed himself during the canyon rescue, was part of a larger conspiracy. Using his knowledge of the Chinese workers' communication network, Charlie orchestrated an elaborate sting operation. He planted false information about a massive payroll shipment, knowing it would reach Frank Moore through Henry's connections. Meanwhile, he positioned trusted workers at strategic points along the canyon walls, using their traditional signal systems to track enemy movements. The trap was set on a moonless night when the desert cold bit through clothing to the bone. Frank Moore's gang, now reinforced with new members, rode confidently into the ambush zone. Charlie had prepared special charges that, when detonated, would create more noise and flash than actual damage. A technique he had learned from his father's festival celebrations in China. The resulting chaos threw the bandits into confusion as signals flashed across the canyon walls, giving the impression of a much larger force surrounding them. Henry Anderson, attempting to warn Moore's gang, revealed his treachery. Daniel Clark, who had positioned himself with a group of armed railroad guards, caught Henry trying to signal the bandits with a mirror. What followed was a masterpiece of coordination between Charlie's Chinese workers and the railroad guards. Using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the Chinese laborers created the illusion of multiple attacking forces, while actually herding the bandits into a narrow box canyon. Frank Moore, realizing too late that he had been outmaneuvered by the very man he had once dismissed as expendable, attempted a desperate breakout. In the ensuing confrontation, Charlie faced Moore in a tense standoff. The outlaw leader, his face twisted with hatred and desperation, spat racist insults while reaching for his gun. Charlie's response was not with bullets, but with carefully placed charges that sealed Moore's escape route, leading to the capture of the entire gang and the definitive end of their reign of terror. The aftermath brought significant changes to the railroad camp. The company, finally recognizing the value of their Chinese workers' skills and loyalty, implemented Charlie's recommendations for better working conditions and fair treatment. Daniel Clark was promoted to chief medical officer for the entire line, ensuring proper care for all workers regardless of origin. Most significantly, the incident led to the first formal investigation into systematic discrimination against Chinese railroad workers. Robert Thompson, impressed by Charlie's leadership and integrity, became an advocate for reform within the company. The story of how a Chinese immigrant outsmarted both outlaws and corrupt officials became a legend in railroad camps across the frontier, challenging long-held prejudices and opening new opportunities for future generations of workers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Charlie Zhang and his fellow workers emerged from their hidden mountain shelter. After 3 days of cat and mouse with Frank Moore's gang, who had taken Daniel Walker and 4 other railroad workers hostage, they finally had a plan. Charlie's intimate knowledge of the explosives used for tunnel blasting would be their salvation, though not in the way the racist foreman Robert Clark had assumed when he'd grudgingly asked for the Chinese workers' help. Through his worn spyglass, Charlie observed the bandits' camp nestled in a narrow canyon. They had chosen their position well, with clear sightlines in all directions, but they hadn't counted on Charlie's experience navigating the treacherous mountain passes during his years laying track through the Rockies. He knew every fold in the terrain between here and Cheyenne, including the network of caves that would prove crucial to their rescue attempt. Margaret Anderson, the camp doctor's wife who had defied her husband's wishes to help tend to the Chinese workers' injuries, crouched beside Charlie. She had grown to respect these men who endured backbreaking labor and discrimination with quiet dignity. When Frank Moore's gang had attacked, targeting the payroll office but taking hostages when the robbery went wrong, Margaret had been the first to insist they mount a rescue, despite Clark's initial reluctance to risk resources for expendable coolies. The rescue plan hinged on Charlie's expertise with explosives and the unique properties of the canyon where the bandits were holed up. Years of setting charges for the railroad had taught him how sound carried through rock, how pressure waves could be directed and amplified. While the foreman saw only a manual laborer, Charlie had studied the science behind their blasting work, understanding it better than the engineers who drew up the plans. Through careful observation, Charlie had noted how the bandits maintained their watch rotation, identifying a crucial 10-minute window when their attention would be divided. He had spent the previous night placing small charges in precise locations throughout the canyon's upper walls, each one carefully calculated to create a cascading series of echoes that would seem to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Susan Clark, the foreman's daughter, who had secretly been teaching some of the Chinese workers to read English, helped Charlie coordinate the timing. She had grown up around railroad construction and understood the importance of precise synchronization. Her father would be furious if he knew she was involved, but Susan had seen too much injustice to stand idle while good men's lives hung in the balance. As the sun reached its zenith, Charlie gave the signal. The first explosion sent a thunderous boom echoing through the canyon, followed by carefully timed secondary blasts that created the illusion of a large force attacking from multiple directions. The bandits, panicked and confused, split their forces to defend against this phantom army, exactly as Charlie had predicted. In the chaos, Charlie led a small group through a narrow cave passage that emerged behind the bandits' position. They found Daniel Walker and the other hostages poorly guarded, their captors having rushed to defend against the non-existent attack. The rescue team moved swiftly and silently, years of practiced stealth learned from avoiding hostile foremen serving them well in this crucial moment. But Frank Moore was no fool. As they led the hostages towards safety, the gang leader realized he'd been deceived. He and his remaining men pursued the rescue party through the twisting canyon passages, forcing Charlie to implement the riskiest part of his plan. He had saved one charge, placing it precisely where the canyon walls showed signs of natural instability. With the bandits closing in, Charlie made a split-second decision that would challenge everything the foreman believed about their Chinese workers. Rather than taking the safe route to escape, he stayed behind to ensure the explosive would trigger at exactly the right moment, buying time for the others to reach safety. Robert Clark, who had followed the rescue party against Margaret's advice, watched in disbelief as Charlie demonstrated a courage that defied all his prejudices. The final explosion brought down a section of the canyon wall, cutting off the bandits' pursuit and trapping Charlie on their side of the rockfall. For tense hours, the camp waited, fearing the worst. But as dusk approached, a dust-covered figure emerged from a seemingly impassable cliff face. Charlie had used his knowledge of the old mining tunnels that honeycombed the mountains, secret passages known only to the Chinese workers who had mapped them during their years of laying track. In the aftermath, the camp's dynamics shifted subtly but significantly. Robert Clark, forced to confront his biases, began implementing changes in how the Chinese workers were treated. Margaret Anderson established a proper medical station in the Chinese section of the camp, while Susan Clark's reading lessons became an open secret that more workers attended. The railroad company's officials, hearing of Charlie's crucial role, were forced to recognize the valuable skills their Chinese employees had long hidden behind careful masks of subservience. Frank Moore and his surviving men were captured by a posse near El Paso, but the true victory was won in the changes that rippled through the camp. Charlie never sought recognition for his role, understanding that sometimes the quietest victories are the most profound. The Chinese workers continued their dangerous work laying track through the mountains, but now they did so with a measure of respect that had been hard-won in the echoing canyons of the American West. As the railroad pushed ever westward, the story of Charlie Jiang's ingenuity and courage became a whispered legend among the workers. It was a reminder that heroism knows no race or nationality, and that true strength often lies in the wisdom to know when to act boldly and when to remain humble. The desert frontier had witnessed countless tales of courage, but few had so quietly changed the hearts and minds of those who lived and worked in its unforgiving embrace. In the months that followed the bandit attack, the railroad camp underwent subtle but meaningful changes. The Chinese workers' quarters were gradually improved, with better materials allocated for their shelters and proper medical supplies finally made available. While some foremen still clung to their old prejudices, others began to see their workers as men rather than merely expendable labor. Charlie's quiet dignity had accomplished what years of protest could not. The railroad company's investigation into Frank Moore's attack revealed a deeper conspiracy involving corrupt officials who had been skimming supplies and selling them in El Paso. Several prominent businessmen were implicated, including some who had openly derided the Chinese workers while secretly profiting from their exploitation. The revelations sparked reforms that, while modest, represented the first real changes in working conditions along the line. Daniel, the young foreman who had witnessed Charlie's strategic brilliance during the attack, became an unexpected ally. He began learning Mandarin phrases from the workers, bridging a cultural gap that had seemed insurmountable. His example inspired others, and soon the evening camps became places where stories and traditions were shared across cultural lines. The desert nights, once filled with segregated silence, now carried the mingled sounds of Chinese and English conversations. As winter approached, the track laying reached a treacherous mountain pass where the workers' expertise in explosives became crucial. Charlie was officially promoted to lead the blasting operations, marking the first time a Chinese worker had been given such authority. The decision sparked tension among some crews, but Charlie's demonstrated skill and calm leadership gradually won over even the most stubborn skeptics. In Cheyenne, where the railroad's regional office was located, Charlie's actions during the bandit attack became part of the official report. While his name was barely mentioned in the official documents, the Chinese workers knew that his courage had opened a door that could never fully close again. Letters began arriving from other camps along the line, seeking advice on improving relations between workers and management. The desert itself seemed to acknowledge the changes, as spring brought unusual rains that softened the harsh landscape. New shoots of green pushed through the rocky soil near the workers' camp, and some of the older Chinese laborers saw it as a sign of renewal. They incorporated these desert blooms into their traditional medicines, blending their ancient knowledge with their new American home. Rachel, the camp cook's daughter who had once shared her father's prejudices, began spending time with the Chinese workers' families, learning their cooking techniques and stories. Her father, initially resistant, found himself amazed by the complexity of flavors in the dishes she learned to prepare. Food became another bridge between cultures, with weekly communal meals becoming a new tradition in the camp. The story of the bandit attack traveled along the railroad line, growing and changing with each telling. In some versions, Charlie became a mythical figure who could speak to the mountains themselves. The Chinese workers smiled at these embellishments, knowing that the truth of courage, wisdom, and quiet determination was more powerful than any legend. As the first anniversary of the attack approached, a small ceremony was held at the site where Charlie's explosives had turned the tide of battle. Workers from both communities gathered to plant a garden of desert-hardy plants, marking the spot where change had begun. The garden became a symbol of resilience, thriving in the harsh conditions just as the workers themselves had learned to do. In El Paso, where Frank Moore awaited trial, word of the changes spreading through the railroad camps reached the local Chinese community. They began organizing to ensure proper legal representation at the trial, demonstrating a new confidence in demanding justice. The case became a rallying point for those seeking to challenge the prevailing prejudices of the time. Charlie himself remained focused on his work, understanding that true change comes not from dramatic gestures, but from daily actions and choices. He continued to teach younger workers both the technical skills of railroad construction and the deeper wisdom of navigating life between two worlds. His quiet influence spread far beyond the desert camps, touching lives in ways he would never know. As the railroad pushed westward, the lessons learned in that remote desert camp traveled with it. The story became part of the complex tapestry of the American West, where courage and wisdom could wear many faces and where the harshest landscapes could nurture the most surprising transformations. The desert frontier, witness to countless tales of conflict, had finally witnessed one of bridge building, not just of steel and wood, but of human understanding.